All right. Well, welcome everybody to our Thursday talk for October. I'm J.D. Crones, the Executive Director of Colorado Headwaters Land Trust here in Granby. And with me this evening is Jody Barbour for the Conservation Tax Credit Transfer. Tonight, we'll talk about her and her role in the land trust community and in conservation, as well as the most recent bill to affect us for the positive, of course. And we'll talk about tax credits and tax credit transfers, especially as they are unique to Colorado and kind of a small segment of the United States. So with that, I'm going to ask Jody to introduce herself and give us some of her background.
Thank you, Jeremy. Hi, I'm Jody Barbour with Conservation Tax Credit Transfer. I'm a tax credit facilitator and have been transferring tax credits in Colorado. Our company's been around actually since 2000 when the tax credit transfer began. I've been in the industry since about 2009 and just absolutely love what I do and working with landowners and folks like Jeremy and all the land trusts. And it's pretty special being able to help landowners conserve their land and help land trusts as well.
That's great. Well, thank you for that. Well, let's start with your history. So have you always been in tax credit in that industry, or what kind of led you to that?
I have not. I actually started out my career after college as a commercial real estate paralegal. Moved to Colorado in '93 after I graduated from the University of Cincinnati and started working with a law firm, actually doing foreclosure work, which was awful.
Sounds very depressing.
And then moved into commercial real estate and did that for 20 years. So it was a really helpful background to have with all the, reviewing title work and surveys and all the due diligence documents that go along with a conservation easement transaction or with a land transaction or any real estate transaction. So it translated very well. I was laid off in 2008 as a commercial real estate paralegal and was totally devastated, but it turned out to be a blessing in disguise because I get to do what I'm doing now, which I much prefer, saving land rather than developing land.
Yeah, I have a few colleagues, and you probably know them too, who made that transition as well. Around that time, they realized that real estate might not be their best industry, but if they have those tools like you did, put them to good use.
Right,
yeah.
Right. Yep.
What are some, I guess, either cultural or community differences you find between the real estate law that you did before and what you're doing now? I know that realtors are not as friendly as I am, so there you go.
Yeah, it's interesting with realtors. There's of course becoming a bigger interest with land conservation, and they're wanting to know about it, learn about it, which is an important aspect for realtors to know. They need to be educated in all sorts, all aspects. On the commercial side, it was, of real estate, it's, it's fairly stuffy. You've got, development or, a new Home Depot or a hotel or a subdivision or a new apartment community, and they're wonderful people, of course. But, working in land conservation, you really kind of get down to the connection of land with the farmers and ranchers or, small landowners, and how important that is to them and helping, understanding all the pieces that go with it. It's just, it's got a huge feel-good factor
Right.
to it for sure. It's all, you still have to maintain that professionalism related to all the documents because they are important legal documents. They're just a different type of a legal document with the conservation easements.
So with that, let's talk a little bit about tax credits themselves. And when I talk to landowners, I pitch it as being unique to Colorado and a smattering of other states. But it seems that in land trust history and conservation history, especially in the last, call it 50 years or so, Colorado has really taken the lead in a lot of these movements. So can you talk about the tax credit program itself? And what we have and why it occurs, and then when you're finished with that, we can talk about this latest bill.
Sure, absolutely. I'll start with a little, excuse me, I've got something in my eye. I'll start with a little bit of the history of the tax credit program. Conservation easements and the tax credit began in '99, became transferable in 2000. From 2000 all the way up probably through 2007, 2008, in the history of the program, things were going along okay. And a landowner would record their conservation easement, and essentially the tax credit existed then once the easement was recording, and there wasn't a formal approval process that we have today. That created some problems because, with any incentive type program, there's going to be people who want to try to take advantage of it. And that happened. So in 2000, really about 2004, 2005, the IRS started kind of snooping around in Colorado and saying, okay, what's going on in Colorado? And then that translated to the Department of Revenue starting to ask questions about mainly appraisal values. And some of them were grossly inflated. So, there have been lots of bills throughout the years, but brought us to this approval program that we now have through the Division of Conservation, which has really strengthened the program and, just given confidence to both landowners doing their conservation easement, getting their state tax credit, and with buyers who are purchasing those credits as well.
I see. Can you talk about appraisals for a second, just in case anyone watches this video might not understand what that is?
Sure. So it's a real estate appraisal, but it's a two-part appraisal. Conservation easement appraisals are very specific. Not all appraisers can do conservation easement appraisals. You have to be a certified general appraiser, and you have to be experienced with conservation easement appraisals. The appraisal is the document that is used to calculate your state tax credit. It's used for bargain and sale transactions if somebody's, doing a partial purchase of an easement and a partial donation of an easement, and it's also used to calculate the federal deduction. So it's a two-part appraisal. It's a standard fair market appraisal, as if a conservation easement has never been placed on property. And this is for people who are doing it first time, they've never had an easement. Right. So it'd be the standard fair market value of the property. Then the second part of the appraisal is a secondary appraisal of the property with the conservation easement encumbrance on the property. So it will value the property before, value the property after. The difference between those two values is your conservation easement value, your dollar value, which is used to determine the federal deduction and the state tax credit.
Mm-hmm. That's a great little summary. I usually explain it that it's conservation values is really what someone would pay to develop the property is what we're going to pay to not develop the property, and people tend to take that in stride.
Right. Yeah. And they're all a little bit different. They're going to depend on, the size of the property, the location of the property. Are you reserving building envelopes? Are you going to reserve a subdivision that if you've got, say, 200 acres, you want to be able to sell, 10 acres off or 50 acres off, or whatever the case may be. So there are lots of variables that go into the appraisal, but it's the document that makes everybody's world go round.
Yeah, that's right. And we haven't had, I don't believe we've had an appraiser on these talks yet, but I'll make sure that happens sometime in the future.
That'd be a great idea.
Yeah, have a good conversation about that. So with these tax credits, you mentioned that they're transferable, they're exchangeable. How does that work for landowners? So I'm putting an easement on my 50-acre piece of property, and I donated the value of it, so I'm getting 100% of the value in exchange for the tax credits. What does that look like when I go to you to help me out with all these forms?
So when a landowner comes to conservation tax credit transfer to get their tax credit, sell their tax credit, I'll try to be quick, but we like to get involved.
No, take your time. It's fine.
We like to get involved up front to try to review, be a part of the transaction with the land trust, with the appraiser. Sometimes an attorney is involved. Usually a good idea for everybody to have an attorney involved, just so there aren't any surprises at the end. It's not an absolute requirement, but a landowner's making a forever decision, so they want to make sure that they're covered and understand everything all the way through.
Well, if I can, just this morning, I had a talk with a potential conservation easement grantor, and he asked me that, should I get an attorney? And I said, yes, you definitely should. I can't recommend one, but go for it. So it's
we've got some, I've got a list of folks that I've worked with through the years, and we can certainly make that recommendation. But in any event, the point of all of that is we like to be involved up front in a transaction so we can review documents along with everybody else to make sure that when we work with the landowner to submit the tax credit application to the Division of Conservation, it's in the best shape possible that it can be in, and there aren't going to be any surprises, after the fact. And it doesn't happen often, but sometimes things get missed. Everybody's looking at the same document. The best example that I can think of, there was a land trust, and this has been, a handful of years ago. But I was reviewing this one was already recorded, reviewing the document, getting ready to submit it for a tax credit application. There was a termination clause in the conservation easement. And I nearly had a heart attack. I'm like, okay, this has got to be an error. Call the land trust, and they're like, oh, no. You're looking at the wrong document. I said, well, pull up your recorded copy. And they almost fell out of their chair. It was an NRCS funded deal. So it was a bargain sale donation or bargain sale transaction. And it took a year to get that corrected. And it was just a verbiage typo that happened somehow. But it took a year to get that cleaned up. Then we submitted the tax credit application. So that's kind of the reasoning why I like to get involved up front and do the due diligence review.
Can I ask what, so I'm, that I don't have a legal background, but I'm learning a lot from my board and staff here. What was the process to resolve that? Was it just a Scrivener's error affidavit, or was there
in the long run? Yes, it was a Scrivener's error, but because it was a funded deal, it had to go through all the approval channels to make that happen, and it takes time. It just takes time.
Wow. That's
so
wild.
Yeah.
I've started drafting our own draft deeds now, so I get a better handle on it, and now I'm kind of scared. I don't want to miss anything like that.
Right. So once an easement is closed and everything's looking good, we work with landowners to submit their tax credit application to the Division of Conservation. There are a lot of technical questions within the application that unless you really kind of know how to answer some of those questions, people aren't going to know. So that's why we assist landowners with that. Plus, you have to upload all the transaction documents, which can be a little bit of a pain. The other thing we like to do is I create a transaction summary to submit with the tax credit application that tells the Division of Conservation, this is what you're going to be looking at. The land is this many acres. It's been in the family for, since 1973 or whatever the case is.
Yeah.
It has, year-round access, and it's, either paved or not paved, and just a brief description about the conservation easement so they can get a clear picture up front of what they're going to be reviewing, rather than, okay, I'm going to review the appraisal first or the conservation easement first, and then the baseline, and try to put a picture together. I like to paint that picture so they have an idea of what they're going to be looking at.
So you summarize the baseline effectively.
I do a quick summary of the baseline. I don't really do anything with the appraisal, but just kind of a brief snapshot of what the division is going to be reviewing with this tax credit application. If there's like, for instance, when a land has a deed of trust or a mortgage on that land, when they go to do their conservation easement, that mortgage has to be subordinated to the conservation easement to be able to qualify for the federal deduction and for the tax credit. So if that's the case, I'm going to tell them, there's going to be a subordination agreement. Or if the minerals have been severed, I try to give them a heads up, minerals have been severed, you're going to see a mineral report. If it's a bargain sale, I try to let them know up front so they know, okay, I have to look for a settlement statement, and I have to make sure that the calculations are correct when calculating the tax credit, just those sorts of things. If it's a non-contiguous property, sometimes you have lands that are two non-contiguous parcels, but both of those parcels are going into the conservation easement, and sometimes they can't be sold separately. So I let them know ahead of time, you have a conservation easement encumbering the entire, say, 500 acres, but they're not contiguous parcels, that kind of thing.
Gotcha.
Wow. So, okay. Yeah. So once that happens, and the application is submitted to the Division of Conservation, they will have 120 days to review that application and issue the tax credit certificate. And
I know that, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
That, there were, as you referenced earlier, a lot of fights kind of early on in the 2000s about tax credits and a lot of confusion. My understanding, being in this role, is that most of that has been smoothed out. There are certainly still some landowners, and if anyone watching has joined us for Hats Off for Headwaters, we had one of the landowners on who's still undergoing kind of a fight about her tax credits. What is the status of that why are landowners still being really kind of picked through, even for transactions that happened years and years ago and that everyone else thought were pretty kosher?
Right. For the most part, all the ones that were picked apart years and years ago are done and through the system. And the reason for a lot of that happening, the authority to approve a tax credit, before we had the Division of Conservation, that authority was with the Department of Revenue. So the Department of Revenue had roughly almost 5 years, pretty much 5 years, after a conservation easement transaction was done to review the appraisal, the documents, the tax credit, and decide that they're satisfied that it met all the requirements. Well, they're Department of Revenue. They're not appraisers. They really didn't have the expertise to do that. They were behind, court cases got behind, cases within the Department of Revenue were behind. So the community is together said something has to change. At the same time, there was kind of an audit of the whole program, which happens from time to time throughout the years. And there were suggestions from all sides, from all stakeholders to say, okay, what can be done differently? How can we make this better? How can we give landowners more assurance that, once they record their conservation easement and transfer their tax credit, that the Department of Revenue is not going to come back 4 years later and say, we don't like your appraisal. So we now have the Division of Conservation that was created in 2018. Before, the authority was with the Division of Real Estate, and then that was a little bit problematic. So in 2018, we all in the community worked hard to get the Division of Conservation. They are now responsible and have the authority to approve tax credits, review and approve tax credits. They approve the transaction before they issue a tax credit certificate. So that's the difference now. And then we can start talking about, some of the changes through the new legislation.
Yeah.
But that gives landowners a lot more assurance, and buyers as well, that once the Division of Conservation has approved their tax, that tax and issued the tax credit, the Department of Revenue, we really haven't had any problems with the Department of Revenue disallowing tax credits, give or take a handful, mainly on tax compliance issues. Somebody didn't file the right tax form, or they wrote down the wrong tax credit certificate number or something like that. So.
Gotcha. Well, let's segue right on into this new legislation and all the changes that it's made.
Oh boy. Yeah, so House Bill 21-1233 was passed in June, signed by the governor, I believe on June 30th. And that has been a tremendous, significant piece of legislation that has done a number of things. Number one, it changed the eligibility of landowners that could qualify for the tax credit, and now includes different water districts, water authorities. And it used to be that out-of-state landowners could qualify for the tax credit, but they would have to create an LLC that could not be a single member LLC. It had to be like a husband-wife LLC or whatever the case might be. Typically, it's a pass-through entity where they could qualify for the tax credit if they went through those hoops to have a pass-through entity. That is no longer a requirement anymore. A taxpayer is, you can qualify for the tax credit if you file a tax return. So that's kind of the magic
baseline.
Right.
Okay.
So that's been a big improvement because it takes away a lot of the red tape, both for landowners and for the Department of Revenue. It's just a lot more efficient for generating the conservation easement and the tax credit and tracking everything through the system. The other thing that the new legislation did is it increased the tax credit formula that landowners can now receive a 90% tax credit for the value of their conservation easement.
And that's really the draw. A lot of people really like that part.
Right. It used to be, roughly 50%. The formula kind of changed here and there a little bit over the years, but now it's a 90% tax credit, up to a $5 million tax credit from one conservation easement donation, with that $5 million being issued in increments of $1.5 million each year in tax credits until the $5 million is hit. Let's see, the other piece of that legislation, it used to be that landowners could get in surplus years, when Colorado had a surplus year and they were issuing refunds from in the state, landowners could get up to a $50,000 refund. But if they did that, they had to be very careful about, well, if we're selling a tax credit, we can only be limited to the 50,000 for that tax year. So they would have to wait another tax year before they could sell a tax credit. That limitation has gone away as well. So a landowner can now, get their tax credit, use part of it, use the refund, sell part of it, carry it forward. So again, all of that red tape is eliminated. The other really important piece that helps, again, with just kind of process and making things more efficient for both a landowner, seller, and a buyer of the tax credit, is a buyer will now receive their own tax credit certificate from the Division of Conservation. So when a tax credit is sold by a landowner, they have 30 days to notify the Division of Conservation that, hey, we've sold this tax credit to this person. And again, we assist with this piece as well. And we'll likely do it on behalf of the landowner to let the Division of Conservation know that, let's say I have $100,000 tax credit. I sold 90,000 to this buyer over here. That buyer is going to receive their own tax credit certificate in their name for that 90,000. And then the division will issue a new certificate to the seller of the tax credit, the landowner, for the remaining 10,000.
Oh, interesting.
And what that does is it just makes things much smoother for both the seller and the buyer. Under the old system with the Department of Revenue, revenue would have to marry up a tax return between a seller and a tax return between a buyer before they would say, okay, everything is smooth and wonderful, let's push this on through. It held up refunds for sellers, buyers, the whole thing. Now that, marriage is kind of is gone, where buyers can get their own tax credit certificate, use it, and move on down the road.
That's great. That definitely makes it easier.
Much easier.
Yeah, I won't ask you about any of the opposition since the bill is all done and passed and we're all really happy about it. Right. But I was wondering, could you talk more about the 90%? Because that's something that a lot of people have a hard time wrapping their head around. Does that mean 90 cents on the dollar? Does it mean 90% of total? Where does that number come from? And really, and feel free to use an example of, this is how much the appraisal was, and use hard numbers just in case someone in the audience might need that.
Absolutely. So the 90% is based on that appraisal that we talked about earlier, that appraised value of the conservation easement. And I want to make it clear because I think a lot of people hear, oh, 90% of value. They think I get 90% of my fair market value of my property. No. Right. I've had a lot of conversations where people have thought that, and that's not the case. It's the 90% of the value of the conservation easement, which again is that before and after value determines your conservation easement value, what that conservation easement is worth. That's the number that creates the tax credit and the federal deduction. And
the quick math there, what I've seen, at least in my short tenure, is that value is generally between 30 and 50% of fair market total value of the property.
It's a good number to use kind of as a guesstimate. We've seen them not super often, but when you have an area that has a very high development pressure, that number might be 75% or 70% or 80%, but I think is a safe number just to kind of play with numbers between 30 and probably 50% reduction in value from a conservation easement is a fair estimate to use.
Right.
So for our purposes, the 90% is a dollar for dollar credit. So let's say your conservation easement value from the appraisal is $1 million. Excuse me, a landowner will receive a $900,000 tax credit. It used to be that a landowner would get a $900,000 tax credit and still have their $1 million federal deduction. But back in 2019, the IRS came up with a new rule that was retroactive to 2018 that said if you receive a state tax credit, and this is for any credit, it's not specific to conservation easements, it ties to tax credits for donating to a university. But the IRS said they view the tax credit kind of as a quid pro quo. So they came out with this new rule that said, when you donate a conservation easement and receive or expect to receive a state tax credit, you have to reduce your federal deduction from your donation by the amount of the state tax credit. So in that example, using the $1 million, you'll have a $1 million valuation of the conservation easement. You'll get a $900,000 Colorado state tax credit, and that would leave you with a $100,000 federal deduction.
And for the $900,000 tax credit, when you sell that tax credit, when you transfer it to somebody else, is it a 1-for-1 when you transfer it to somebody else and you sell it? Or is there another equation there that has to kick in?
So generally, the tax credit market kind of sets the return that a seller is going to receive for selling their tax credit. Generally across the board right now, buyers are purchasing tax credits for 90 cents on the dollar. Landowners are receiving, pretty much a net 85 cents on the dollar return. The buyer gets a 10% discount, and then our transfer fee to do all the paperwork and get the credit transferred. Sorry, my dog's barking in the background.
Yeah, and my dog just perked up because of it. So, yeah.
Is a 5% transfer fee. So out of 100% value of the tax credit, a landowner would receive 85 cents on the dollar. Buyers get a 10% reduction or savings on their tax liability, and the 5% is for the transaction fee. So that's just kind of easy numbers to work with to figure it out.
Yeah, quick math. But it's still, at least in my experience, it at the end of the day, if everything goes smoothly, everyone seems to walk away pretty happy.
Right, exactly. Right. I mean, so when you convert that tax credit to cash, that is, dollar for dollar cash that's coming to a landowner, and, using that $1 million, they're getting 85 cents on the dollar return. That's a really nice number.
Right.
Most landowners don't have enough income to utilize that tax credit. That's the beauty of the tax credit program. They can take that tax credit and convert it to cash, and they can use that money to retire, or to be able to retire and pass the land to the next generation, or buy more land, or pay off their mortgage, whatever the case may be. The beauty of it is it's keeping lands in family generations. It's setting up a legacy and allowing the future generations to take over.
Right. And that's really one of the core reasons that a lot of us are in this job is,
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, there are many other reasons to do this and to be in the land trust world, but continuity of ownership and keeping the space open and productive is definitely high on that list.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's fantastic that we have these tools to be able to do that here in Colorado.
So with that, and thank you for that summary. That was a really great one. And I've been passing out the flyers that you gave us to my board and other landowners who are interested. So I might be asking you for a few more, at least the
Absolutely.
PDF. Yeah.
And I can send them digitally as well, so you can send that on to folks, rather than having to mail it out.
Right,
also.
right. And I might, if I can figure it out, I might try and put it in the body of the caption for this video when it goes up.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah. So we're coming up on about half an hour, and I'm curious to know. So you've been in this role for some time. How have you seen the land trust community itself? Right, not including a lot of the issues that happened early on in Colorado land trust history, but how have you seen the community change in the last decade or two, and for the better or for worse?
The only thing I can compare it to, Georgia has a transferable credit. It's changed along the years and it's not as prevalent. But when I worked in Georgia, there was not a cohesive conservation community. I mean, there kind of was, but all the land trusts were kind of on their own. And you could really feel a kind of a pretty competitive, sometimes butting head community. And it was really different than what, we see here in Colorado. Colorado, it's pretty remarkable. With all the legislation that has come through the years, you would think people would just throw up their hands and say, let's just not do this anymore. But it is so important, for working lands and natural landscapes and water and all of the issues that we face here in Colorado. The community here in Colorado with land conservation is, in my opinion, top of the line, top notch. People butt heads with each other and have disagreements, but all in all, we all understand how important this is and that it really does matter and it helps change people's lives. It's a really strong community. The land trusts all support each other for the most part that I have seen. We're all in this together. So let's keep working together. keeping this program as strong as it can possibly be. And it is in fantastic shape with, the new legislation that just passed and all the things that we've done over the years to, eliminate any fraud or eliminate any problems. That's pretty remarkable that we've all come together.
Yeah, I've had colleagues from elsewhere in the country comment on that it seems like, it actually happened in my first week. The very first meeting I ever went to when I moved here was the creation of Keep It Colorado, which is the statewide coalition of land trusts.
Right.
I walked in totally blind and they said, out with the old, in with the new. This is the community that you're walking into. And I felt welcomed, and I'm sure many others do as well.
Yeah. Colorado's been a conservation leader for years, decades. So it's, coming into that and working in that realm is pretty special.
Yeah, that's great. Well, unless there's anything else, I just want to ask if there's, one more point that you want to make to either to myself and my colleagues or landowners or anyone from the public who might be watching. What's a take-home message you'd like to give them?
Really understand or try to understand, because it's, some of it's technical and it gets very boring and very dry. Yeah. We're talking about taxes.
Yeah. That's why I email you so often
I think the most important thing is, understand what you're getting into up front, ask questions, use, us as a resource, Jeremy as a resource, ask around. Forever is a long time. So really think about what you want to do. Different land trusts have different priorities and they're willing to accept different things. If a building envelope is important to you for generations, for the next generation, think about that. Just really take the time to think about it. I think sometimes people are like, oh, I need money. I can do this by getting a tax credit and, but there's tax consequences with that. So, which we didn't talk about a whole lot. But the flyer that's in there talks about some of those consequences. A conservation easement tax credit, when you convert it to cash, it is taxable income. So how does that fit into your plan? If you, let's say you're going to get a $1.5 million tax credit, how are you going to utilize those funds? Is it worth holding on to it for a year and a day to take advantage of long-term capital gains? Talk with the professionals, really think about what you want to do. I think that's the biggest take home. Use this as a resource. Happy to answer questions and help out.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jody. This was a really great conversation. And I hope to have you back maybe next year. We can have an in-person class with realtors and others in Grand County to talk more about this in person.
That'd be great because there's a lot to talk about. We can cover a whole lot.
Right.
All right. Thank you
so much again. Have a good night.
Right. Bye.
So thank you everybody for joining this evening. I'm going to put up the slideshow again just so you get some more information. And I look forward to talking to everybody next month at our talk in November.